I never expected my heart to sink this early in December. But the moment my husband casually mentioned that his ex would be joining our Christmas dinner, I felt it like a punch to the gut. At first, I thought I had misheard him, that maybe his words had twisted in my mind, but the way he said it, so nonchalantly, as if it were perfectly normal, made it painfully real. My stomach knotted, my hands went clammy, and I felt that familiar sting of jealousy I'd worked so hard to bury. I couldn't help but remember every time she had crossed my mind, every story he told, every quiet comparison I sensed but never voiced. How effortlessly she had commanded his attention before. How I had always felt like an intruder in the shadow of someone he once adored. The thought of her smiling across my carefully decorated living room, taking up space at our table, made my blood boil. I tried to reason with myself. Surely it would just be polite small talk, but even that tiny hope felt fragile. Memories of past holidays, moments where I'd felt invisible in his eyes, crept in like uninvited ghosts. My fear wasn't just about her being there. It was the unspoken challenge, the silent judgment I imagined in her glance. Could I ever seem enough while she existed in the same room? My mind raced with every possible scenario, each one more humiliating than the last. And yet, beneath the fear, a quiet determination began to burn. I would not let this Christmas turn into a quiet battlefield where I was left unnoticed, replaced by a shadow from the past. Somehow, I needed to reclaim the space she had once held, to remind everyone, especially him, that I was not the person to be underestimated. The room around me felt smaller suddenly, the festive lights dimmer, as my mind plotted silently, knowing that tonight would test more than just holiday cheer. It would test my patience, my pride, and my ability to turn dread into a weapon of subtle power. I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back to the early days of our relationship. The times he would speak of her with a wistful tone I pretended not to notice. He never said it outright, but I saw it in the way he smiled at certain memories, how his eyes would flicker with longing whenever her name came up. At first I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that the past was just that, the past. But over the years, the little signs accumulated like tiny cracks in the foundation of my confidence. I remembered the holidays where gifts and attention seemed unevenly distributed, the subtle comments from family that hinted she had set the standard, and the times I felt like an understudy in a life I had thought was mine. It wasn't just jealousy. It was the quiet sting of comparison, the sense that no matter how much I achieved, I could never fully eclipse the ghost of someone he had once adored. That fear of being overlooked or replaced, of fading into the background, had always lingered like a shadow over our happiest moments. And now, with her coming to Christmas, that shadow loomed larger than ever. I imagined her walking through the door, confident, perfectly dressed, her presence commanding attention without even trying. Would everyone notice her first? Would my husband's eyes betray a flicker of admiration I didn't deserve? The thought made my chest tighten, the familiar FOMO gnawing at me, reminding me of every time I had felt second best. I thought about the subtle favoritism that had marked our family gatherings, the quiet praise for her successes, the way her opinions carried weight in conversations, the unspoken hierarchy I had to navigate just to be heard. Every holiday memory seemed to replay like a warning, and I realized how vulnerable I felt to being compared once again, how easily this dinner could shatter the fragile sense of control I had built. But beneath the anxiety, a spark of resolve began to form. I would not let the past dictate the present, and I would not allow myself to be diminished in the eyes of everyone who mattered. This Christmas would be a turning point, one way or another, and I silently vowed that I would emerge unbroken, even if it meant orchestrating the night to ensure my presence could never be ignored. As soon as I accepted the reality of her attendance, I realized I couldn't leave anything to chance. This dinner had to be perfect, not just festive, but strategically arranged to give me the upper hand without anyone realizing it. I began with the decorations, carefully selecting colors and accents that would highlight warmth and elegance while subtly reflecting my own tastes, an unspoken reminder that I had cultivated this home and this life. The seating arrangements became a chessboard in my mind. I placed people deliberately, balancing allies near me and those likely to side with her further away, ensuring I could steer the conversation and control the flow of attention.
Even the menu was part of the plan.
Each dish was chosen not only for taste, but for the conversations it might provoke, small cues designed to elicit admiration, envy, or gentle embarrassment at her expense. I thought about conversation topics in advance, planting seeds that would reveal her discomfort or awkwardness, while giving me the chance to shine effortlessly. Every detail, from the placement of the candles to the subtle background music, became a tool in my silent strategy. I even rehearsed how I would enter the room, confident but not showy, ensuring that my presence felt natural yet commanding. While some might call it overthinking, I knew that when facing someone who had once held influence over my husband and others, preparation was my only shield. By the time the night arrived, I wasn't just hosting dinner. I was orchestrating a delicate dance of perception, subtly positioning myself to emerge unshaken, admired, and undeniably in control, all while the audience of my family would watch unknowingly as I quietly set the stage for the reversal that would define the evening. The doorbell rang, and my stomach dropped into a pit I hadn't felt in years. I knew it was her before I even opened the door. Her presence has a way of filling a room without a word. She stepped inside, perfectly poised, a casual smile playing on her lips, and my blood boiled. I watched the way she carried herself, every flick of her hair, the way her eyes scanned the room, silently assessing, claiming, measuring. My husband greeted her warmly, almost too warmly, and I forced a smile, but inside I was trembling with a mix of fear, jealousy, and simmering rage. I noticed the subtle stares from family members, the small whispered comments exchanged behind cupped hands. "She looks amazing," someone said. "I didn't expect her to come," murmured another. Every syllable felt like a quiet challenge, a reminder of the past, of the comparisons I had tried to bury. My mind raced through everything I had planned, the seating, the conversations, the subtle ways I could turn the energy in my favor. I clenched my fists beneath the table, reminding myself that tonight I wouldn't be a passive observer. I would respond to every glance, every remark, with the perfect mixture of grace and quiet power, turning tension into opportunity. As she laughed at something my husband said, a flash of anger surged through me, sharp and consuming, but I tempered it, letting it simmer beneath the surface. I would not let my emotions betray me. Instead, I would channel them, using each simmering thought to sharpen my strategy. The room felt smaller suddenly. The festive lights dimmed under the weight of this unexpected confrontation, and yet a spark ignited within me. I knew, even as my pulse raced, that this arrival marked the beginning of something bigger than holiday small talk. It was the first move in a silent duel I had intended to win, and I was ready to stake my claim. I began with the smallest gestures, almost imperceptible, but calculated to land just right. A compliment here, polite yet edged with subtle superiority, a casual mention of a recent promotion or success, a story about a trip or achievement that hinted at status without arrogance. Each word was carefully chosen, designed to make her notice, to make the room notice without seeming overt. I watched her reaction closely, an almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, the quick glance my husband stole toward her, the flicker of tension in the air. I could feel the empathy triggers working on the others too, drawing them subtly into my perspective, letting them see her as just another guest, while I quietly asserted my place. I told a story about the children, casually highlighting how they adored me, how our family thrived under my attention, making it seem effortless. Every laugh I drew, every approving glance, was a small victory, a subtle rebalancing of the invisible scale that had tipped in her favor so many times before. I noticed the flickers of discomfort in her posture, the micro-expressions that betrayed unease. My internal monologue reminded me to stay poised, to keep the tone conversational, warm even, while each phrase was a tiny needle aimed to unsettle. The tension between us grew, unspoken yet palpable, a quiet war fought in glances, half smiles, and the weight of carefully crafted words. By the end of the first hour, I sensed the shift. The ex no longer dominated the room, and I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction knowing that every subtle cue had begun to tip the balance, setting the stage for the more decisive moves yet to come. As the evening unfolded, I began to notice the subtle alignments forming across the room. My sister leaned slightly toward her, nodding at every comment with exaggerated agreement, while my mother offered polite smiles that seemed to weigh in the wrong direction. Even my cousins, usually neutral, exchanged quick, knowing glances that hinted at loyalties I hadn't anticipated. I felt the familiar sting of favoritism, the invisible currents that had shaped every family gathering I could remember. But I refused to be swept away. Quietly, I observed every gesture, every look, every half-spoken sentence, storing them in my mind like pieces on a chessboard. My internal dialogue ran fast, cataloging potential allies and adversaries, noting who might be swayed by a well-placed word or subtle revelation. I imagined the ex noticing these silent alliances, the tension between appearances and reality pressing on her as keenly as it did on me. I reminded myself that perception was power. The way I carried myself, the calm smile, the measured responses, all conveyed confidence even in the face of undercurrents I could feel, but not yet confront openly. Each whispered comment or sideways glance became a piece of the puzzle, a way to gauge which moves would land with impact. The room was alive with silent politics, hidden grudges simmering beneath festive cheer. And I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the thrill of anticipating my next move. I had identified the weak spots, the gaps where subtle influence could shift the balance, and I knew the night was only beginning. Each family member's reaction told me more about the battlefield I had entered, and for the first time that evening, I felt the edges of control slipping into my hands, ready to reshape the dynamics to my favor with careful, deliberate precision. The moment I had been planning for finally arrived. I stood gently tapping my glass, drawing the room's attention without hesitation. Conversation paused, eyes turning toward me, and for a heartbeat, the ex looked at me, confident in her place, only to see the shift forming before her. I began my toast with warmth, thanking everyone for being together, sharing memories of the children, the holidays, and the laughter that bound us. Then, almost casually, I mentioned a recent milestone, our home renovation, the new career opportunity I had just accepted, the project I had led successfully, all framed in a way that highlighted my achievements without seeming boastful. I noticed the slight stiffening in her posture, the subtle narrowing of her eyes, the fleeting glance my husband stole toward me, as if acknowledging her diminished aura. The room's energy pivoted. Conversations naturally flowed toward me. Stories turned to my anecdotes, and the ex found herself slightly adrift. Her previously commanding presence softened by the invisible tide. I watched quietly, savoring each glance, each moment of unspoken recognition, knowing I had engineered it with precision. I could feel the FOMO radiating from her, the unspoken realization that she was no longer the center of attention. That comparison now tilted in my favor. This wasn't just a toast. It was a demonstration of subtle dominance, a reminder of what she had lost and what I had earned. By the time I finished, raising my glass with a smile that conveyed both warmth and quiet power, the room had shifted unmistakably. I had turned the first tide, staking my claim with grace, leaving the ex scrambling to recalibrate while the family silently aligned with the new balance of authority and admiration. Just as I began to feel the weight of the room settling back into its usual hierarchy, I felt a shift I hadn't anticipated. My cousin, usually quiet and reserved, leaned toward me with a warm smile and whispered a supportive comment about how wonderful everything looked, how proud they were of the way I had organized everything. That small gesture sent a surge of relief through me, and I realized the importance of visible allies. Another nod from my aunt, subtle but unmistakable, reinforced that my position was gaining legitimacy in the eyes of the family. I noticed the ex's expression falter for the first time, a micro-expression of doubt flickering across her face, a twitch of unease at seeing my support quietly solidifying. The cracks in her confident exterior were like tiny windows revealing vulnerability, and I felt a quiet thrill knowing she could sense the subtle shift without understanding exactly why. I used the opportunity to reinforce my presence, engaging my supporters in conversation that naturally drew attention, highlighting shared memories and inside jokes that subtly included me as the center of warmth and connection. Each interaction was a gentle assertion, a quiet declaration that I belonged here just as much, if not more, than anyone else. I noticed how the ex's smiles became slightly forced, how her posture stiffened, and how the room's energy began bending toward my orbit, validation and admiration gravitating naturally in my direction. I allowed myself a fleeting sense of triumph, savoring the first real signs that my careful orchestration was taking effect. The audience watching this unfold in my mind, the family, my husband and even her, was experiencing a subtle reversal, one that fed my confidence and hinted at the more decisive maneuvers yet to come. I could feel the energy in the room, a fragile equilibrium that had shifted slightly in my favor, but I knew it wasn't enough. It was time for the next move, the one that would make the subtle tension explode. I cleared my throat and with a casual smile, brought up an old story, one no one expected me to mention. I spoke of a holiday years ago, when my husband's ex had orchestrated a situation that humiliated someone in the family, a selfish act that had been quietly buried, never discussed. The details rolled out naturally, as if reminiscing about a distant memory, but each word was loaded, each pause deliberate. Eyes widened, whispers began circulating, and I could see the ex's confident mask faltering. My husband stiffened beside her, realizing too late that the story revealed a part of the past he had hoped remained hidden. The family murmured among themselves, shocked at this glimpse into behavior they had never noticed or had ignored, and the subtle alliances began shifting once again. I let the silence linger, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle. She tried to interject, her voice faltering, searching for credibility, but the atmosphere had already turned. Every glance was now measured, every reaction magnified, and I could feel the balance of power teetering, poised for the next move. This wasn't just a revelation. It was the pivot, the exact moment where the ex's confidence cracked, leaving her vulnerable and everyone else questioning what they thought they knew. As whispers filled the room and eyes darted between us, I felt the anticipation spike. The tension was electric, and no one, not even her, could predict what I would do next. I had pictured this scene 100 times, turning it over in my head like a puzzle I had to solve. The twist I had dropped earlier had already unsettled her. Now I needed the decisive move that would make the change unmistakable. Dessert had just been cleared and voices had quieted into that soft hum families fall into at the end of a meal. I rose slowly, feeling every eye find me, and walked to the center of the room with a calm I cultivated on purpose. I began by thanking everyone, speaking in a tone warm enough to lower defenses. I talked about traditions, small kindnesses, the rituals that kept us connected. Then, without drama, I steered the memory toward honesty. I spoke about promises that were easy to make and hard to keep, about the way tiny humiliations stacked into something that eats at a person's dignity. I told the story of someone whose confidence had been quietly undermined over time, leaving scars no one had bothered to see. She flinched, a twitch so quick I almost missed it. She tried to laugh it off, to redirect the conversation back to safer topics, but the air had shifted. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, not as a threat, but as an instrument of truth. I read a single message aloud, short and ordinary in tone, but damning in content, a line revealing how she had engineered an embarrassing moment years ago to make someone else look incompetent so she could shine. The words landed like a stone thrown into still water, and the ripples spread. My cousin's face crumpled. My mother's smile became tight. My husband's expression changed from guarded to raw, his jaw working as if trying to swallow regret. She opened her mouth and closed it, searching for a response that wouldn't sound hollow. The room hummed with mutters. Who knew this? Why had we never noticed? And those murmurs coalesced into a tide that pulled at her composure. She attempted an apology that sounded practiced, and in that moment, the practiced nature of her charm revealed itself as armor, thin and brittle. I could have reveled in the moment, could have let triumph balloon into scorn. Instead, I spoke about consequences and responsibility. I explained why I had kept the message. Not to punish, but to protect my family from patterns of manipulation. I said that small cruelties mattered because they taught children what behavior is acceptable, and I refused to let that lesson be one of cunning and undermining. My tone was steady, measured, and that steadiness did more to dismantle her posture than any cutting remark I could have offered. Then my husband asked the questions that had been waiting to be asked. He asked why things were always handled quietly, why people were spoken about behind their backs instead of to their faces. His voice was low and full of things he'd left unsaid for too long. The ex's defenses, already brittle, began to crumble. She offered explanations: immaturity, misunderstanding, the pressure to appear perfect. But her words faltered against the evidence and the faces around the table that now looked at her differently. At one point, she reached for the table as if to steady herself. Our hands brushed. I didn't pull away. There was no warmth in that touch, only a clear, cool boundary. I met her eyes and gave the briefest nod, not triumphant, but final, as if to say, "This is over." That single nod felt heavier than any speech I could have made. It was a quiet verdict. The web she had woven was visible now, and the family could decide what to do with that knowledge. My father, who rarely spoke on matters of emotion, stood and said plainly that he valued truth over appearances. The ex sat down too quickly, the color gone from her cheeks. In those few minutes, the room's dynamics rearranged. The invisible crown she had worn in family circles had slipped. People approached me after softly, offering small acknowledgments. Sorries that sounded sincere, hands on my shoulder that conveyed a new allegiance. It wasn't the vindictive closure of a public spectacle. It was something quieter and truer. A realignment of what we tolerated and what we called out. I remembered every small indignity I had swallowed. The dinners where my voice had been interrupted, the times I had smiled while my stomach nodded. That memory made the victory taste unexpectedly sweet. Not because I enjoyed another's fall, but because I had been allowed to reclaim the narrative of my life. People approached me afterward, eyes softer, offering quiet apologies that felt like mending stitches. A cousin squeezed my shoulder. An aunt offered a small, sincere compliment about how I had kept the house feeling like home. Those gestures stitched new threads into the fabric of the evening. When conversations thinned and the house began to feel ordinary again, I noticed how the air had changed. There was less tension under the surface, fewer sly smiles. The ex retreated to a corner, speaking to no one, her confidence hollowed. I sat down and exhaled, feeling the tightness in my chest ease. There was relief, yes, but also a strange sorrow for what had been lost, and a quiet pride in what I had reclaimed. My husband reached across the table and took my hand, his touch warm and apologetic. "Thank you," he said, and those two small words held regret and an invitation to rebuild trust. The night did not end with vindictive triumph or spectacle. It ended with an honest public correction and a sense that boundaries had been redrawn. I had orchestrated a confrontation that made truth visible and left the family with a choice about how to move forward. As people drifted into smaller clusters, the glow of the candles seemed to steady rather than shimmer, and I felt quietly and decisively that I had reclaimed my place, and we would remember this night. The tension that had filled the room all evening slowly began to dissolve, leaving a quiet hum of conversation that felt different, lighter, more measured, more aware. I sank into my chair, feeling a rush of relief wash over me, the kind that comes after holding your breath for far too long. The ex was subdued, quietly sipping her drink in a corner, no longer commanding attention or projecting control. My family, once subtly aligned against me or caught in old loyalties, now treated me with a newfound respect that didn't need to be stated aloud. It radiated in their glances and the small nods they offered when our eyes met. My husband reached for my hand, a gesture full of acknowledgement and remorse, and I felt the weight of the evening settle into a sense of vindication. I allowed myself a private smile, savoring the way subtle power had shifted in my favor, how careful observation, strategy, and patience had paid off without overt drama or cruelty. In my mind, I replayed moments, the poised toast, the stories I had chosen, the gentle but precise nudges that had changed the room's dynamic, and realized how intentional planning could create real impact. I reflected on my own strength, how I had transformed anxiety into measured action, fear into strategic composure, and simmering anger into quiet, undeniable authority. While the ex's presence lingered like a fading shadow, it no longer threatened or intimidated me. Instead, it reminded me of how far I had come in claiming space, recognition, and respect. The family's interactions subtly realigned. Conversations flowed more evenly. Laughter returned to shared memories, and old grievances seemed to lose their power under the influence of honesty and assertiveness. I sipped my drink, letting warmth spread through me, knowing that tonight had reinforced not only my position, but also my self-worth, teaching everyone present that I was neither passive nor invisible. As I glanced around the room, catching snippets of conversation and fleeting looks of admiration, I realized that victory need not be loud to be undeniable. There was a quiet grace to it, a satisfaction deeper than triumph, rooted in authenticity, poise, and the knowledge that I had orchestrated a night where truth, respect, and subtle power prevailed. As the evening wound down and the last of the dishes were cleared, I found a quiet moment to sit back and reflect on everything that had happened. The adrenaline of confrontation had faded, leaving a calm clarity I hadn't felt in years. I thought about how much I had grown, how the fear and jealousy that had once consumed me had been transformed into careful observation, strategy, and self-confidence. I realized that my worth had never been defined by comparisons, favoritism, or the opinions of others. It had always existed within me, waiting to be claimed. The subtle shifts in the room, the alliances I had strengthened, and the moments where truth quietly revealed itself were reminders that empowerment comes not from loud declarations, but from clarity of intent and measured action. I thought about the ex, not with malice, but with recognition that her confidence had relied on appearances and manipulations, and that the moment those facades cracked, I had been prepared to step forward without fear. My husband's acknowledgement, the tentative respect of family members, even the humbled silence of those who had doubted me, all reinforced that authenticity and composure carried more weight than anyone had anticipated. I felt a profound sense of closure, understanding that the validation I craved had been earned through observation, patience, and deliberate choices, not through petty retaliation. In that quiet moment, I promised myself that I would never allow others to diminish me again, that I would continue to act with integrity, and that I had the power to shape my life and the perceptions around me. The warmth of the holiday lights reflected the calm pride I felt, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to simply breathe and savor the satisfaction of knowing I had reclaimed control, dignity, and respect, leaving the audience with a sense of moral closure, emotional empowerment, and the quiet triumph of self-worth realized. Even as the house quieted and the last guest drifted away, I couldn't ignore the lingering tension that still hovered in the corners of the room. The ex had left with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, and I caught a brief glance from my husband that carried both relief and unspoken questions. I knew some wounds hadn't fully healed, that the echoes of favoritism, past betrayals, and unspoken comparisons would remain beneath the surface, invisible to anyone but me. Yet, I also recognized that the night had shifted the balance in meaningful ways, giving me validation, respect, and a sense of control I hadn't felt before. The glow of the Christmas lights felt softer now, almost reflective, mirroring the complex mix of triumph and lingering unease. I allowed myself a quiet sigh, acknowledging that life and family rarely offered perfect closure. There would be moments of awkwardness, perhaps subtle reminders of old hierarchies, but I had claimed my place with grace and careful strategy. In that realization, I found satisfaction tempered with realism. Victory was never total, but it was enough. Enough to remind myself, and the people around me, that I mattered, that I could navigate the complexities of family and emerge whole, confident, and quietly unshakable. I stood by the window, watching the snow drift silently past, and felt the full weight of the evening settle around me. The tension, the strategies, the subtle maneuvers, all of it had brought me to this moment of quiet triumph. I thought about the ex, her carefully constructed confidence now cracked, and about my husband, who had finally seen me as more than just background in someone else's story. I reflected on the lessons the night had offered: patience, observation, self-worth, and the power of measured action over impulsive emotion. For the first time in years, I felt fully in control, grounded in the knowledge that I could handle whatever challenges and challengers came my way. A small, satisfied smile touched my lips as I whispered to no one in particular. They didn't know who they were messing with, and now they never will. In that line, I carried the weight of validation, empowerment, and quiet revenge, leaving behind a sense of closure that was both satisfying and realistic. The story had ended, but the impact lingered, an echo of composure, strength, and the quiet certainty that I had claimed my rightful place.